Welcome to Global Power Shifts with me, Jim Stenman. This is the show where we unpack how influence moves, alliances shift, and narratives evolve across the world stage. Today, we're diving into what some see as one of the most misunderstood power blocks in global politics, BRICS. Now, it's easy to reduce it to headlines about challenging the West or creating an alternative world order, but as today's guest, Gustavo de Carvalho, explains, that framing kind of misses the mark. A seasoned policy expert who's worked for the African Development Bank and is a researcher with the African Institute of International Affairs, Gustavo joins us to set the record straight. Now, we explore the group's real ambitions as he sees it, what its recent expansion means, and why, despite the noise, BRICS may be less about disruption and more about reform. From internal disagreements to perhaps an overblown prospect of de-dollarization, this episode pulls back the curtain on what the West often gets wrong about BRICS and what the group actually wants. Let's get into it. All right, so just to sort of kick things off, can you just offer a little bit of background how you became an expert when it comes to international relations with a view to BRICS specifically?
I'm Brazilian originally and have been in South Africa for the past 18 years. So to a certain degree, when I finished my bachelor's degree and my master's degree in international relations, African studies, for me it made a lot of sense coming to Africa to spend some time engaging with the issues. I don't think I was expecting that I was going to spend almost 2 decades here, but the engagement with BRICS has always been a fairly natural space for me to interact with. Being Brazilian, having been part of a lot of the discussions we had in Brazil in the 2000s on the precursor of BRICS, that was IBSA, the India, Brazil, South African group. And certainly when South Africa joined the group in 2011, we have increasing demand for understanding what is this thing that we got ourselves into and how meaningful or not that is, not only for our foreign policy, but particularly domestically. What is the implications for that on day-to-day lives of South Africans? But we hear the same questions in every other BRICS countries.
And I mean, obviously you moved from Brazil to South Africa. You're still in the global South. I'm in the global South, usually based in Dubai. And it's interesting seeing how BRICS is viewed in the global South versus the West. Not to put you on the spot or anything, but I mean, what do you think it is that the West gets wrong when it comes to BRICS, maybe in particular the United States?
I think it's a very important question because I think a big part of understanding BRICS is understanding what it is and what it is not. And what I find with many of the narratives within the West, I think there is often a sense of paranoia about it. I think there is a sense that it is a group that is intending to overtake everything and to change the global order in a way that we don't recognize our own space. And I think in reality, when we start engaging with it with a slightly higher degree of granularity, we get a better sense that BRICS is a group of countries that want to have a bigger say in international governance issues. It is a group that, because of the way that it operates, its degree of informality, we see an important role of China and Russia, but certainly not a group that is so dominated by them that no other voices and no other ideas are able to be presented. And I think these are often some of the narratives that are presented. And I think part of my job, to a certain extent, is to try to make sense of it and try to explain it to a wider variety of audiences in a way that shows that, well, there is an intention of having a bigger say in international organizations, in broader governance issues, but it's not a group that has really operated as an overhaul, as a replacement of existing institutions. It's far more complementary.
Many politicians that are based in Western capitals, I think it would be fair to say that they think of BRICS as an alternative world order. I mean, how should the general public in the world, or maybe in the West in particular, think of BRICS? Is it a geopolitical bloc, an economic alliance, a bit of both?
BRICS started very narrow focus. 2009, when the group becomes the group, at that time was only BRIC. South Africa hadn't joined yet. But the primary objective was to promote reforms in international financial institutions to ensure they have a bigger say. And if we look a little bit deeper into what that means, they were fundamentally talking about having a bigger say in institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank, like WTO, and so on. Certainly over time, BRICS started gaining much more institutions attached to it. When we talk about, well, BRICS countries want a new global order, we can use that a restaurant analogy. BRICS countries want a seat at the table. They're not really looking to go to a completely different restaurant. But they also feel that when their voice or their ability to influence discussions where they feel they should have, considering the size of their economies, their influence in their own regions, and so on, that makes them wanting to create, rather than alternative, complementary tools to what we have at the moment. And I think that is, for me, is a fundamental way of seeing the group. Far less revisionist than it seems, and perhaps a bit more reformist than we would like to give it credit for.
And I guess the key thing to keep in mind there is the fact that a seat at the table doesn't necessarily undermine the interests of Western powers.
Precisely. And if we look into some of the sibling organizations to BRICS that were either strengthened or created around the same time, whether it's the G7 or whether it's the G20, all of those institutions, as informal as they are fundamentally looking for similar answers to common challenges, to global challenges. That idea of consensus for BRICS tends to tone down a lot of individual narratives that we have from countries like South Africa, Brazil, China, Russia, and to a certain degree, what allows them to do is often something that is far less revisionist in shape and form, and finding ways of what are the things that we can actually do together, but what are the things that we have to agree to disagree. And I think this ability of agreeing to disagree is very much at the core of how the group works. That when something is so geopolitical that you will not be able to find consensus, those issues are either taken out of the agenda completely, often happens, or they are diluted to the point of what I call irrelevance, or they are heavily negotiated. And those points, they take a long time for them to actually find some kind of an agreement, meaning that this idea that BRICS is going to overnight change all of the structures, we don't see in reality. What we see is a paced, slow process that is trying to figure out where we can agree here and understand that, well, we are disagreeing too much on this issue. And maybe we can find other venues to engage with those.
Can you talk a little bit about where we're at the moment when it comes to BRICS? Because the name BRICS, the abbreviation, it almost doesn't do the organization justice anymore, especially with this expansion.
I think the first point that I think is very important to talk about is the issue of the name. For BRICS members, they see the name BRICS as almost as a brand. So they feel that the same way that the G20 didn't change its name after the European Union joined or the African Union joined, it didn't become G22. For BRICS, the name remains as such. But it gave a particular momentum for a discussion that has been happening already for a number of years within the group, that the identification of the means of settling trade as not as a common good, but as a political tool that has been often utilized to reduce the ability of other countries to potentially actively engage with that. There was a sense in 2022 that when Russia gets kicked out of SWIFT and it's unable to engage in transactions using the US dollar, that we thought that Russia was a bit too big to be sanctioned that way. And what if it is us at some point? Or worse, what if it is China, where at least 140 countries in the world that have China as the largest bilateral trading partner would have a big challenge of dealing with? That it strengthened that view that we need to not replace the SWIFT. SWIFT is there and we utilize SWIFT for a reason. It's liquid, it's cheap, it's fast. But they also find that we need to develop some mechanisms that allow us almost as an insurance, that in certain situations it would make sense for us to settle our trade in South African rand or in Brazilian real or in Indian rupees and so on. But we know that it's not really going to replace the US dollar at all. I think sometimes there is that misconception that BRICS countries are actively pursuing a process of de-dollarization. More what they are doing is they're actively pursuing a process of diversification because countries like Russia or like Iran, they're not looking to de-dollarize. They are already de-dollarized. They are already trading in other currencies, particularly with the Chinese renminbi. Now we're moving from 5 countries to 11 countries, and that makes decision making a little bit more complicated. There's the importation of some bilateral or continental issues that didn't exist before. If we think of the rivalry between India and China, that was already quite important. We now have Ethiopia and Egypt, potentially Saudi Arabia, which hasn't yet confirmed whether they are members or not, but are attending many of the BRICS meetings at the moment. Saudi Arabia.
I think they played that one very well because they knew that Trump was likely to get reelected.
Yes, and also for the Saudis, even with a Democrat administration, a lot of the discussions between the Saudis and the Americans since the Abraham Accords, what types of guarantees and particularly security guarantees we can get from the United States, at that time primarily talking about normalization of relations with Israel. But at this stage is a much broader discussion. And we saw that recently with Donald Trump's visits to the Middle East and to the Gulf and how much that is relevant to them. But also, and this is my personal perspective, I think it's for them a very smart bargaining tool to showcase that, well, we also have options at this stage.
Just to push you a little bit on the tariffs, I mean, how does that impact BRICS? Are there opportunities because of what the US is doing?
It's a difficult question individually. We've seen from the reactions of China, countries like Brazil largely benefiting from the trade war between the US and China, because certainly if China is not buying soy and beef from the United States, they will do it from Brazil, a very large producer. As a group, it's still very uncertain how they are going to collectively react to that. But there is some indications of what it would mean. I think one is that it does give a stronger impetus to this process of creating mechanisms for settling trade with local currencies, because there is a sense that the United States is a far riskier environment than what we felt it was. It's not simply perspective that it could happen in the future. It's happening right now. The second issue is that it provides a space for more consensus when it comes to the concerns on the way in which the global order is run and managed. To specifically for BRICS as a group, that softer aspects of developing narratives, developing views about the world, and presenting them to the world, those broader aspects, even if they are not presented so directly to counter the United States, they will be presented in terms of the risky environments that we live internationally and the importance there is to reform international financial governance and international financial institutions, because this over-reliance on the United States, which was the primary driving force for the creation and for the establishment of many of those institutions that were created after 1945, right now the United States serves as a major disruptor of those institutions. At the moment, BRICS countries are some of the biggest supporters of particularly those in relation to international financial organizations. And that changes the environment largely.
How effective has the new development bank been in terms of helping some of the poor nations when it comes to development? I remember having a conversation with a government minister in Ethiopia who was quite keen on BRICS, particularly because of the new development bank. So what sort of impact are we seeing in that area?
I think it's an interesting question because it helps us to separate BRICS from some of those institutions. The fact that BRICS expanded to 11 members doesn't mean that they would automatically be a member of the new development bank. And I think it's something you mentioned, the case of Ethiopia, which recently been announced that it's going to join the new development bank. But they were not guarantees. There was a lot of anxiety in Addis Ababa with the possibility of, well, are we going to join BRICS and are we not going to be allowed to join the NDB? Now
Mm.
it seems that anxiety that has been rested. But I think if we look
Are there any
into
requirements in terms of having to have your financial house in order to be able to do that?
not quite, not quite. And we have members of the NDB that are not BRICS members. The original five members, or as I like calling the B5 of BRICS, still have majority of ownership of the new development bank. And that provides a minimum ownership that the original five would have of the bank. And that minimum ownership is of 50% collectively. So there is a smaller role of the new members of the NDB. The bank in itself, I would say, it provides some interesting financing for infrastructures. It provided financing during the COVID reconstruction in many of these countries and so on. We're seeing projects and increasingly an expectation and an objective of the bank itself to increase the level of also providing financing in local currencies. We see a number of projects in South Africa already, but we're talking about the objective to go up to 25% of the portfolio. And it has so far provided loans and finances up to around 40 billion US dollar plus minus, meaning that as a development bank is a relevant one, but as a development bank is a fraction of the size of the World Bank, is a fraction of the size of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, heavily backed by China. It is still smaller than many other regional banks that we have. So what the new development bank created is not a panacea that we're suddenly not going to need money from the World Bank or any other international financial institutions. It just added to the portfolio. We have another tool in the toolbox that can be utilized and triggered depending on the needs, depending on the situations.
And in terms of the internal dynamics with BRICS, you mentioned both Ethiopia and Egypt now being members. Obviously, there's friction because of the Grand Renaissance Dam. How does BRICS navigate internal disagreements, and to what extent is, a senior member like South Africa driving the BRICS agenda on the continent?
The good thing is that we have almost 16 years of experience between China and India. They have a bitter rivalry. They cannot agree on a lot of things, but they find ways of compromising, finding spaces where they would agree on things and make those decisions. So how would, for instance, Ethiopia and Egypt deal with the issues about water management and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam? Probably by not utilizing BRICS as a mechanism for negotiation. It's often as simple as that. But it doesn't mean necessarily that there would always be disagreements between Ethiopia and Egypt, and there will always be, and South Africa would be able to navigate that. So the fact that there are disagreements between members in very fundamental issues doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to disagree. But certainly what we do have now is a much more complicated space to identify consensus. But this ability of agreeing to disagree is also remaining as a fundamental aspect on how BRICS operates on a day-to-day basis.
And on that, do you think that BRICS offers any lessons to similar groups in terms of how to navigate that?
Yes, I think there's many lessons, good and bad lessons. As a positive lesson, there is certainly a benefit in terms of pulling resources, pulling thoughts, and pulling credibility, legitimacy, size, or whatever we want to call it, for countries that are looking to have a bigger say in specific issues. And I think that is the fundamental principle of what multilateralism is. It's a very imperfect group in many ways, shapes, and forms. But what it does provide is the ability of driving certain agendas that enable countries to be much more proactive and at times, not always, influential in the way that the decision making happens. The very perspective of its own influence and size and relevance, that in itself, I think it provides a lot of lessons for us on how to ensure that the global order is managed in a way that is reflective on power distribution and economic capabilities globally beyond the thoughts that we had in the 1940s on what would the global order be managed. I think that really gives us a number of hints of how the future of multilateralism could look like.
What do you think are sort of the main things that BRICS needs to focus on to stay relevant in the next couple of years, particularly under President Trump, because he is a disruptor, and we know that he's not a big fan of BRICS itself?
There is a kind of a paradox, because to be more relevant, BRICS needs to continue delivering tangible results. The narrative aspects are important, but they are not sufficient to really ensure that its very members continue committed and believe that this is something worthwhile for us to do. But the paradox of that is that the more tangible things are done, the more visible it becomes, and the higher is the likelihood of a degree of a backlash, not only from Trump, but I would say from non-BRICS members that may have challenges with some of those views and thoughts and institutions and mechanisms. But also, how do you ensure that in the case of a backlash for those tangible things, that you're also able to navigate such a backlash in a way that doesn't make the global order more fragmented than what it already is, in a way that allows the group not just to be another acronym amongst many of those that we've seen over the decades, and many of them may even remain in existence, G77, the non-aligned movements, but really have a fraction of the influence that they once had. So for BRICS, it's really important that doesn't just become a talk shop and a space to share thoughts, views, ideas about the world, but it's really able to showcase tangibly what it is able to offer to its members.
And finally, as we wrap up, you mentioned that there's a summit coming up this summer. It's going to be in your home country, your other home country, Brazil. What are you looking for there?
I don't expect much, and it's not because I'm being pessimistic about that, but from looking into the levels of conversations and the levels of development, a lot of the issues are the same. They are about trading with local currencies. There's some specific issues on health and education and agriculture and so on, but nothing to the level of visibility that we saw in 2023 after the expansion. But for BRICS, to a certain degree, boring is good because it shows this kind of paced approach. We should expect some developments when it comes to BRICS Bridge or BRICS Pay, that are two mechanisms that are being discussed at the moment within this broader context of settling trade with local currencies. But we shouldn't expect that by July the 8th, that this is going to be up and running and every BRICS member is going to be utilizing that. This is going to take quite some time. What I would hope to see is perhaps more progress when it comes to the discussions on institutionalization. And by institutionalization, it doesn't mean a hyper-formalization of the group, but certainly these discussions about predictability, a better understanding of roles and responsibilities, that I think could be particularly beneficial for the group. Certainly far less interesting from a media perspective and from a broader perspective, but I think it would fundamentally be a really important step towards a stronger BRICS. That doesn't mean that a stronger BRICS is necessarily a confrontational BRICS. And to a certain degree, I think it is part of how we see BRICS operating regularly. And Brazil has a difficult situation this year too. It just hosted a massive G20, is about to host COP30, and BRICS is somehow squeezed between those two. It really overstretched the Brazilian bureaucracy capacity of organizing such types of events, meaning that it remains important for Brazil, but perhaps not to the same level that we saw in Russia last year or even for South Africa the year before.
That was Gustavo de Carvalho offering nuance and clarity on a topic too often mired in misconceptions. Here's what's clear to me. BRICS isn't trying to burn down the house, it just wants a seat at the table. And in a world increasingly shaped by multipolar dynamics, ignoring that impulse, I think, would be a mistake. As the bloc grows and the world shifts, BRICS will have to do more though than just make noise. It'll have to deliver results, manage contradictions, and prove that it can institutionalize a new kind of influence. Thanks for tuning into Global Power Shift. If this episode made you rethink the headlines, share it, leave us a review, and don't forget to subscribe. We'll be back soon with more voices decoding the big shifts that are shaping our world. Until then, I'm Jim Stenman. See you soon.